Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, I'm having a discussion with historian Graham Broad. We're going to be talking about the early years of the Royal Flying Corps and its connections to Canada around things like training, recruitment, and kind of what that looked like. So today, Graham's going to show us some good stuff. So welcome aboard, Graham. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this. This is a topic that, as you know, isn't talked about nearly enough.
No.
But lots of really interesting stories here. So, and you've got some really cool pictures and stuff to show us. So I'm really looking forward to see what you got going for us here. That'd be awesome.
So I'll just, if you want, I'll just share screen here. Just give me one moment.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting photo here you should all be looking at. This is actually a group of Canadians at the Wright Brothers Flying School. Just outside of Dayton, Ohio in 1915. What are they doing down there? Well, I'm gonna tell you in a second. I guess we might start actually at the end, Brad, and just say that by the time you get to November of 1918, about 22,000 Canadians had served in the Royal Flying Corps. It's exact numbers are hard to come by because the RFC was a British outfit. The Canadian government really didn't keep records on which Canadians served in it. And the British government wasn't as interested in that question either. And so exact figures are hard to come by about how many of those 22,000 were pilots. I've seen estimates as high as 12,000. Let's say it's 7 or 8. Even that would be, closing in on a third of all British pilots in the First World War in the British flying services were Canadians, which is hugely disproportionate to population. It's really quite extraordinary. So why did this happen? Well, it's a bit of an open question, but I think one of the clues to figuring it out is to look at things in the very early days. And, whenever I talk about aviation in the First World War, though, the first thing I always remind people is that when the war broke out in August of 1914, the airplane was still a new and experimental technology. I think that's really key to understanding aviation in the First World War. There's too much of a tendency to look at it from our side of the telescope. Got to look at it from their side of the telescope. This was a new technology, as far newer to them than, say, cell phones are to us, for example. The first flight in Canada was in 1909.
Right.
And even in the UK, the first flight was in 1908. And when we say first flight, we're really talking about demonstrations of the principle of lift. I mean, not practical aviation yet, right? That comes even later.
Right.
I mean, it's not until summer of 2009 that somebody finally crosses the English Channel, for example. That was considered a huge accomplishment. So when the war begins, you're talking about practical aviation in Europe, maybe being 4 or 5 years old. Back here in Canada, it was still a newsworthy event when an airplane appeared. Most Canadians had never seen an airplane. In my hometown of London, Ontario, the first time an airplane flew over London, Ontario was during Victoria Day celebrations in 1912.
Wow.
Just 2 years before the war. So most Canadians had never seen a plane. So when the war erupts in August of 1914, there's a number of Canadians who are interested in flying. They've never flown themselves, or very few of them have, but they're air-minded. They were fascinated by aviation technology and they wanted to fly. But of course, there was no Canadian Air Force yet. There was an abortive attempt to create one in 1914. Basically, Sam Hughes gave a charlatan $5,000 to buy a plane, and he absconded with it and was never seen again.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting story from the beginning, right?
In itself, yeah.
Yeah, at the beginning with the Valcartier story, and then you throw that, hey, we had an Air Force for about 5 minutes, but not really.
It's a fascinating story, and it would actually make a great movie, but
it probably would.
So there's no Canadian Air Force, and so Canadians who want to fly are told, well, you have to join the British flying services, which are the Royal Flying Corps attached to the Army and the Naval Air Service attached to the Navy. And but there's no formal mechanism for doing so. So they advise a lot of people, well, what you should do is join the CEF, apply for a transfer once you get over there. And this is the eventual pathway for about a third of Canadians who serve in the British flying services in the First World War. A lot of them went this way. Billy Bishop would be a famous example of somebody who started off on the ground, ended up in the air. Another example of a much earlier aviator many Canadians don't know about who took that path would be this guy, Henry Cope Evans. Notable for a lot of reasons. He was actually born in the UK, came to Canada, worked as a fruit farmer, and then went on to be a range rider out west. He's actually credited with introducing the game of polo in Canada.
Uh-huh.
And when he joined the RFC, he was actually one of the oldest pilots in the RFC at 36. Same thing. He was in a cavalry unit, traded in his horse for an airplane in late 1915. The problem with going that CEF route is that a transfer wasn't guaranteed, right? Once you're into the administrative tangles of the CEF, you weren't necessarily guaranteed to be able to transfer if you wanted to fly. So what you had was a pool of people who wanted to be direct applicants. And again, it's not quite clear about how to do that. Until the very beginning of 1915, the RFC and then the RNAS established recruiting missions here in Canada. And by recruiting missions, I'm really talking about one guy in each case, or over here, or maybe
Right.
with a tiny staff with them to recruit pilots. And they set down a couple of stipulations for Canadians who wanted to fly. First, you had to be an officer already in some branch of the armed forces. They'd had a couple of cases in 1914 of Canadians who went overseas, applied to be into the flying services, washed out of pilot training, and then they're kind of stuck over there without any military training at all, and they can't fly. So what they said is, look, be an officer already in some branch of the flying services, because pilots are generally officers in the First World War. And that way, if you wash out of flight training, you can simply attest for the CEF as an officer. Second, and this was the more difficult stipulation for people in these early days, you had to already have a civilian aviators certificate. What was called an FAI certificate, Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. And the reason that was so difficult for Canadians to get in 1915 is really there were two reasons to get that civilian aviator certificate first. I mean, the British basically wanted you to prove that you could at least handle an airplane in the air before they took you into the flying services. There was two reasons it was difficult for Canadians. One, it was very expensive. It cost about $500 to take civilian lessons, which at the time, for a common laborer, would be about half a year's wages. Two, there was only one flight school in all of Canada. And that flight school in 1915 was at Long Branch in Mississauga. This was the McCurdy School, sort of run as a franchise of the Curtis School of Aviation, McCurdy being the first Canadian to fly. So they flew bottom right here out of Long Branch in Mississauga. They basically had a grass strip and a few huts. But they also flew out of Hanlan's Point at Toronto Island, which is really the beginning of aviation at Toronto Island, now Billy Bishop Airport, of course. The problem facing this school is that the summer of 1915 was very rainy. The aerodrome turned into a bog. They only had a couple of planes that weren't very mechanically reliable. In fact, the head of the British recruiting mission, Colonel Burke, said, "This is the worst aerodrome I've ever seen." And they were having a lot of trouble graduating pilots. They had hundreds of Canadians wanting to fly, get their certificate, and then join the RFC or RNAS, but they weren't getting through flight training. They actually looked for a while at relocating to Bermuda, and those plans fell through. So other Canadians looked further afield, since the school in Toronto just wasn't graduating many pilots. One of those people about whom I've written a book was this guy, Alfred Edwin Mackay. Eddie Mackay was born near Stratford, Ontario, grew up in London, Ontario, is an outstanding local athlete and a student at Western University. A lot of those early pilots, by the way, were students, university students. And Mackay was one of those air-minded people, fascinated by aviation, apparently. As soon as the war began, he announced that he wanted to join the flying services. And then in May of 1915, after finishing his first year at Western, he began the process. And so he began the process by taking out a commission in the Canadian militia that would get the officers training, right? That was part of the requirements. Again, didn't join the CEF, because once you're in their administrative tangles, there's no guarantee of transfer. But joining the militia, much easier, because when you're not performing your militia duties, you can take flight training, which is exactly what he did. So he got commissioned a lieutenant and then captain, actually, in the 33rd Hurons. And then went looking for a place to do his flight training. And the Toronto school is full. And so the next nearest flight school was the Wright Brothers School of Aviation in Dayton, Ohio. It was still owned and operated by the surviving Wright brother, Orville Wright. I shouldn't say operated by him. He sort of just oversees it. And in fact, he sells it later that year. But Wright quite shrewdly cut his prices in half that year, from $500 to $250, because he knew there was a ton of Canadians out there who needed their initial flight training.
Right.
And so McKay actually went down there at the end of October 1915. He spent the summer raising money to go down. And when he got there, the place was full of Canadians. And so this photo, which is in the Wright State University archives, really fascinating photo. All of these guys at the flight school at the time are Canadians, either going into the RFC or the RNAS. The majority of them at that time were going RNAS. The RNAS had a rep for being more prestigious because the Navy was considered the senior service in the UK.
Right.
And also they had the advantage of flying out of the home islands, as opposed to the RNAS was not yet deployed to the front in France. So it had a rep for being safer and just nicer. You were in the UK as opposed to on the Western Front.
Right.
So anyway, these are all Canadians, and McKay's there in the back row. And I just want to zoom up for a second. So that's McKay on the right, and on the left, just coincidentally, that's Roy Brown. It was there at the same time as him. Roy Brown, much talked about a couple of weeks ago, or I think last week actually.
Last week, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, anniversary of the final flight of the Manfred von Richthofen, the infamous Red Baron. Brown, one of the people plausibly credited with killing him, shooting him down. We don't know for sure who did it. It might have been Australian ground crew and so on. So really an interesting group of people. In fact, I'll go back and so sort of two down from McKay's left, that's Lloyd Bredner. Bredner was chief of the air staff in Canada during the Second World War. So, you know, this is really sort of an embryo of some people who went on to outstanding military careers here. That flight school faced a lot of challenges, like many of them did at the time in 1915. In that there's just too many Canadians wanting to fly and not enough planes. There were only 2 Wright flyers, for example, and Roy Brown actually smashed one of them up on his flight training. So they only had one for a while. And they've got 30, 40 Canadians at a time wanting to fly and get their pilot certificate. And the other thing is that even in Dayton, the weather was turning bad. So the whole flight school went down to Augusta in December, Augusta, Georgia. And this establishes a precedent for the future. The RFC Canada after 1916 will establish a relationship with Texas. They actually established a flight school down in Texas, right, for winter training in particular, because the weather was better down there. So here we have the Canadians. It's basically the same group of people down in Augusta, Georgia, getting their finishing up their flight training there, but with only 1 or 2 Wright flyers operational. What was supposed to be a 10-day course of study, and think about that, 10 days, about 4 or 5 hours in the air to get your civilian flight certificate, your FAI certificate. What was supposed to be a 10-day program, 4 or 5 hours in the air. In fact, took in McKay's case about 12 weeks. For Roy Brown, it took something similar. He finished a little earlier than McKay. So it's really a ramshackle process at first. It's one in which civilian and military is working together. It's really not a streamlined process yet in 1915. Another interesting guy is this guy, AW Nick Carter, went on to be a Canadian flying ace in the First World War and went regular RCAF after the war. Nick Carter, once again, to get his civilian training, he didn't go to the Wright School for some reason. He went down to this school in Augusta, St. Augustine, rather, Florida. This is the Thomas Brothers School of Aviation, and it run by total hucksters, which was not uncommon at the time.
Yeah.
He got down there and found out that they only had 1 plane, and it was still crated up. And so the flight students were sort of used as labor to uncrate this plane that they bought and piece it together. And the flight instructors themselves barely knew how to fly anyway. Carter apparently had to physically threaten one of them to get actual instructions out of him, but managed to get enough to get his FAI certificate. So, this early flight training is a very slapdash process for Canadians to get through. But when they got through after their 4 or 5 hours of training, they could then take their FAI test, which in North America was administered by the Aero Club of America. And this is actually McKay's original pilot's license, which was in the hands of his family.
Oh, wow. That's a cool piece to see.
Yeah, it's a neat piece, eh? And you'll notice they're numbered sequentially. So he was number 401. Roy Brown was a bit ahead of him, I think number 390 or something. And so that sequential numbering, by the way, will include Americans. So if we're talking about Canadians, McKay maybe would have been 75th or something. To the end of 1915, the total number of Canadians who are in some part of the process of getting into the RFC or RNAS is maybe about 350, very, very low numbers. This, by the way, going to the Canadian War Museum once everything is open again. So they've got 4 or 5 hours in the air, but they're not pilots yet, right? And so at this point, though, if they've got their officers training, or they have their officers commission, they've got their FAI certificate, RFC and RNAS will take them, pay for them to cross the Atlantic, and actually pay them a stipend at that point of about 75 pounds, which was about 325 bucks, to help offset the cost of the flight training that they'd already paid for. Okay, so they didn't have to pay for it entirely out of pocket. And then they'd go into the British flight training system itself.
Right.
That flight training system in 1915, once again, it's very slapdash. I really want to stress that while they had a body of theory pre-war about how military aviation should work, the actual process of making it work was trial and error, right? Like in 1914, you can count on your fingers the number of guys who fired a gun in the air, dropped a bomb from the air, taken a photo from the air, the core functions of the flying services, right? So all this has to be learned through an often fatal process of trial and error. People like McKay and Roy Brown were fortunate to arrive just a little bit later. They, by say February, March 1916, new regulations are coming back based on the experience of 1915 that lengthened their flight training in England before they were deployed. And so in McKay's case, for example, he got to France with about 45 or 50 hours flight training, which is still shockingly low by later standards. But by the standards of, say, 1915, it's actually quite good. In 1915, it wouldn't be uncommon for someone with 15, 20 hours to be dispatched to the front. That's the situation up till then. And then after the Battle of the Somme, where air power is really used comprehensively, I think, for the first time in an air-land battle, there's a huge expansion in the flying services. And at the end of 1916, the British government makes a formal deal with the Canadian government to establish flight training here. And thereafter, military schools open up across the country and in Texas under the RFC Canada, and thousands of pilots are trained. And just one final thing I would say is this: nonetheless, if you consider pilots as a percentage of the overall forces, there's still a minuscule service, right?
Yes.
Of all Canadians who serve overseas in the First World War, you're talking about maybe 3 or 4% or something like that are pilots.
Yeah, the highest estimates. Yeah.
Yeah, the highest estimates. And what this meant is that individual pilots could appear to be prominent in a way that individual soldiers on the ground often couldn't. And because this is a fantastical new technology, they really captured the imagination of people back home. And the British were somewhat reluctant to use their pilots for propaganda purposes. The Germans and the French weren't. It took time for the British to accommodate themselves to that. But what's interesting is back in Canada, where the press is much less censored than in the UK, they're not afraid of exploiting pilots for propaganda purposes. So if you take the case of Eddie McKay, for example, this is just a small selection of news that was in the press in Canada about him. And he wasn't even particularly prominent compared to, say, the way Billy Bishop would be later, for example. But here he is in headline stories and photographs of him in the local papers. Some of these stories went national, following the exploits of an individual pilot. And I think that this type of thing may explain why there was an explosion in recruitment here. Because they were so prominent in the press, and whole letters by him published uncensored in the local papers and so on. And I think that may have got the ball rolling. A lot of young people are seeing this in the news. It looks glamorous, and they're signing up for flight training. Brad, just before I start talking, and I know you've maybe got some questions, I'll recommend 2 books, and I hope you don't mind if I plug my own.
Not at all. Please do. Plug away.
Biography of Eddie McKay. It's actually 2 books. It's a book about Eddie McKay and a book about how I wrote the book. It's a discourse on method. And C.W. Hunt wrote a really nice history of the the sort of the last half of the story after 1916
Right.
of Royal Flying Corps pilot training in Canada for Dundee Press.
So I wanted to ask you, because again, this is so fascinating, and there's so much. You mentioned that they had the private training, I guess you could call it, at the beginning with the flight schools and the problems that entailed. And I was wondering if you could expand on what that training actually meant, if so to speak, up in the air. I was going to say on the ground, but that doesn't make any sense.
Sure.
And then what that would look like, maybe even Britain, for these early Canadian aviators.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I mean, I think what the RFC and RNAS authorities wanted was some proof that you could at least handle a plane in the air before they went to the expense of paying for your passage overseas.
Right. Okay.
That you could at least have a chance of making it through the military flight training, which was much more comprehensive than the civilian. And by the way, I should add that in the UK, that particular requirement to have your pilot's license first, that was also the case for the RFC and RNAS at the beginning of the war. Later, what they allowed you to do was to get your FAI certificate as part of your training, and then in military training. And then in 1916, they just dropped the requirement altogether. Yeah, the civilian training was very, very basic. The Wright School was 4 to 5 hours of flight in the air. The McCurdy School at Long Branch, I think they promised something like 500 minutes or something like that in the air, about 8 hours total in the air, and you might not even get that. And so these would be for quite low altitude flights. You would learn the basics of operating the controls, doing figure eights without touching down. And then your FAI certificate, when you got it, basically involved doing a series of figure eights. You weren't allowed to touch down. You had to perform a couple of landings. You had to attain a certain altitude, but which was only a couple of 100 feet, and hold that for a certain period of time.
Right. Okay.
And very often, by the way, for pilots, their first solo was also their FAI test. And so,
Okay. And that's a little nerve-wracking, I would imagine.
And there were actually quite a few crashes. Roy Brown actually crashed on his FAI test, and he was lucky to survive, because, of course, it changed the aerodynamics of the plane when there's no longer the weight of the pilot in it, right? Because these early planes were really quite light. That training, I would say, would be almost useless when it came to the military training, and even the military training by the standards of late 15 and early 16. Roy Brown's letters are actually on file at the Canadian War Museum, and he grosses incessantly about that. In fact, he says he would have been better off if he'd never learned to fly in a Wright Flyer, because its controls were so much different than what he had to do in even the most primitive of military planes, such as the one I showed earlier, the Maurice Farnham Shorthorn. So yeah, there'd be very little relationship between the two. I think what it might be, though, is just a bit of a sorting mechanism over, who was at least terrified in the air versus, who could stomach being at altitude or something like that.
Was there, again, you might not have an answer, but was there a class thinking behind that? Because again, like, this isn't cheap. So are they trying to do the self-selection there, right?
For sure.
Especially if they are all officers.
There definitely is a certain class bias in the UK itself, especially at the beginning of the war. There was a sense that the RFC was a kind of gentleman's club, that early in the war in particular, they sort of, a recent book, I'm going to forget the author's name, I apologize, but the book's called Reckless Fellows. And the author talks about how early in the war in particular, the RFC pilots sort of styled themselves as sort of fox hunting gentlemen, who in an earlier age would have been cavalry, but now they've traded in their horses for planes.
I see.
Pre-war aviation was very much a hobby that was very expensive hobby, sort of well-to-do gentlemen, slightly eccentric, perhaps, gentlemen, pilots. Now all of a sudden you've got, as the war gets bigger, you've got people who aren't of that social class, wanting to be pilots. And you've got colonials wanting to be pilots. And so the reports of the early recruiting missions here make for some really interesting reading, because there's an intense snobbery on the part of the early British recruiters here about Canadians. They often remark that Canadians will make good pilots because they seem to be naturally quite sort of brave and rugged individuals, but that they wouldn't make very good officers. They don't have the kinds of qualities that we expect in gentlemen, right?
And
So
you
they
see that
suggest
across the services for the Canadians.
sure,
I mean, that's not
same type of bias.
as we've seen. Yeah, that applies to the Army as well. So.
Yeah. And so there's a suggestion, maybe we should start to have more NCO pilots. As it turns out, those officer ranks, as we know, just through necessity, expand during the war, and it changes the character of that sort of class-based structure of the military's changes, or it's subjected to strain, I guess I would say. It never fully changes, does it?
No, I would say in my reading about it, not as obviously as close to what you have done, but it doesn't seem to. It's always got that kind of, that old boys club, upper echelon kind of, I don't know, like an air to it. But, obviously that's not everyone who's part of the flying services, but you still get a bit of that.
Yeah, and I think especially in these early days in 15, if you look at the kinds of things that recruiters are asking potential pilots here and in the UK, it's do you know how to ride a horse? Where did you go to school? Did you play the right type of sports? Did you play rugby and so on, football? Because those are sort of the markers of belonging to a certain class, a certain status of people who they thought were more suitable to be pilots.
Now, just kind of one final question here, and it's a little outside the scope, but what we're looking at here, but I think it's an important one, and I'm sure people are wondering about it. Is there sort of, even in this Battle of the Somme, an organized mission in Canada for recruitment and training, is this kind of an embryo for what you see for the end of the First World War, like I just mentioned, but also into the Second with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan?
It's such an interesting question, and it's something I was talking about with our mutual friend Mike Bechtold, and Mike, one of Canada's best aviation historians, and I were talking about this, that we both feel there's potentially a lot of work here to do. So any doctoral students listening, it's potentially a very good
we got a topic for you.
Because I don't think enough there's been some sort of tangential links put forward in sort of the official history of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Yeah,
that comes through even for, like, say, when I'm doing research on like posts or things like that. It just kind of comes through. It's never explicit,
Yeah, but there definitely is a precedent here. I mean, by the time you get to 1918, they've trained over 10,000 pilots here, which in the neighborhood of 10,000 pilots are in the training mill by the end of the war. So that's a pretty extraordinary achievement for a country where most Canadians hadn't even seen a plane in 1914. And I think maybe in embryo form, it sort of lays the idea, or lays the seed of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan later, which of course will arguably Canada's single most important contribution to Allied victory in the Second World War.
Yeah, so I just think it's so interesting to see how these things are, like I said, tangentially connected in books and official histories and things like that, but nothing explicit. So again, like you said, anybody's listening and interested in this stuff, maybe you got a topic there you can work on.
There's a book to be written for sure. Yeah,
there's a lot out there, so it's definitely worth looking at. So that's good. If you have anything else, Graham, or
no, that's it. A fascinating topic. I'm glad to have talked about it for a brief time today, and thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on, talking about a topic again that's not talked about much, but is so fascinating, and there's so much going on here with class, technology, dashing air pilots, that kind of fun stuff. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, everything that too. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
You're right. There's another topic that could be several theses probably. But anyway, so thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Brad.
So we'll put a link to Graham's book there. No problem with plugging. I like doing it. Get the good word out there and read it. It's good stuff. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We got more coming up. A lot of topics being covered over the month of May. So like the videos, comment, share, maybe ask some questions. We'll see what we can do. So thanks everybody for coming on.